With years of having taken photographs for my blog for QueerJoe.com, and most of it being photographs of my knitting projects or crochet projects, I found it's very difficult to take photographs that adequately show the drape of the fabric or the quality of the fabric that's resulted. And one of the things I saw Franklin do one time is, in front of a video camera, he actually bounced a lace garment around so that you could really get a sense about how lightweight it was, how it kind of draped over his hand. And so I wanted to give you a sense about some of my latest projects and what the actual fabric is for those. The drape of a knitted fabric or crocheted fabric is really important in terms of the design of a garment. You need to know, is it going to be a relatively rigid and structured type of fabric that might be good for a sweater that you might want to give little shape to, but have the shape really define the wearer? Or do you want something that's more clingy and drapey to somebody as far as a sweater goes, type of thing? So anyway, I wanted to go through a couple of things that I've been working on lately. The first one, and this was done a little while ago, is actually a very bulky yarn done in a very loose crochet stitch, kind of a faux hairpin lace sort of way. And you can see that it's got a little bit stiffer of a fabric, and that's due in large part to the density of the yarn itself, as well as the stitch pattern. So when you take a closer look at the stitch pattern, you can see that it's got quite a bit of thickness to it, and so the weight of the fabric is a little heavier, and the way it would kind of drape on somebody's neck and stuff like that, you can see it's a little bit more structured and a little bit more rigid than some of my other more lacy items. Secondarily, this is the interlocking crochet scarf, and you can see, if you take a little close-up version of this, and there's other videos on this as well, you can see how meshed it is. This one is a much lighter weight fabric. Now, this is done in sock weight yarn, and it's also done on a larger crochet hook than you would normally use for sock weight yarn, and as a result, it's got a much lighter drapiness to it, almost lacy. It's not quite lace weight in terms of its lightweightness, but you can see also how it would sort of loosely drape and curl up a little bit and actually not hold a lot of shape and structure to it as you're doing that. The next one is a somewhat new project. If you remember a while ago, the Pioneer Fiber Mill, I had talked about on an earlier blog, had sent me 3 hanks of the yarn that they had milled at their mill, and they were just beautiful yarns, but they were all quite thick yarns, and they're all at least in part alpaca, and so I wanted to show some of those. The first one is kind of a bulky alpaca yarn, so you can kind of get a sense about how thick the yarn is if you look at it in relationship to my fingers, but you can also see that it creates a very dense fabric and a very heavy fabric. And so as I swatch this up, I wanted to make sure that I clearly understood what this would be good for, and I think this would be much better as a very heavy sweater, or even an outer garment like a jacket or something like that. It would make a nice piece like that, or potentially even a very strong rug if you wanted to do a more textured pattern that would give it a little bit more, even a little bit more thickness than it already has. But it's already a pretty thick and rigid fabric, especially for alpaca, because alpaca typically drapes a little bit more. Second swatch I did using one of his yarns is Surrey alpaca, which is a much finer, silkier weight. The yarn itself is also a little bit thinner. You can see that it's got a slightly more thinness to it, although it has a little bit more haze to it, or a little bit of a halo to it. But you can see how much this drapes. This drapes like typical alpaca does when you knit a fabric with it. It's also very got a lot less structure than most of the other fabrics that I knit up. The final one was actually a combination, and also kind of a bulkier yarn, but a combination of wool and alpaca. And it's a beautiful yarn. And it turns out that I think the light green, the limey green sort of color is the wool part, and the brown part is the alpaca part. But it also created a very dense and a very thick fabric. It's not quite as thick and dense as the bulky alpaca that I showed you to begin with. And you can kind of see again how thick this yarn is. It's practically, I think it's about as thick as the first alpaca yarn that I showed you from these swatches, but still yet the fabric is a little bit looser and it's a little bit nicer. The next thing we have is the cross stitch scarf that I've been making a few of lately. This is a very, like the interlocking crochet scarf that I showed you before, this is a very drapey, almost lacy again garment. In fact, it's even a little bit lighter weight and a little bit more bouncy and drapey than the interlocking crochet piece. The crochet gives a little bit, almost always gives a little bit more of a denser, thicker garment or fabric than knit typically. And so this particular one you can see actually has a really nice hang to it. And again, when you drape it, you can see it actually drapes almost like a lightweight fabric almost. The next one we have is something I did a while ago. I think I called it the bright lizard scarf or something like that because it reminded me of some of the colors of a lizard. This is also knit, but it's done in, I think it's a DK weight yarn, and but it's also done on a looser needle than you would normally do. And so again, it gives you a very drapey, very loose fabric. I love this fabric. It's heavier than the sock weight yarn scarves that I've knit with, but it's got a beautiful heft. This is one of my favorite combinations of stitch patterns, when you use a DK weight yarn that's got a little bit of weight to it, and so it hangs a little heavier than some other fabrics might, but you knit it on a bigger needle than you would normally do for a DK or sport weight yarn, and that way it maintains a loose drapiness to it, so that when it hangs heavy, but it hangs loosely. And that combination I find really useful and very nice. Finally, I'm working on a new project these days. It's actually similar to a project that I've worked in the past. It's kind of a bias knit wrapper scarf. It's going to be a very wide scarf. It's probably going to end up being about 10 or 11 inches when it's complete, if I don't put a border on it. But it's knit on the border, and it's knit all in garter stitch. But it's also knit on very lightweight yarn. And so you can see the weight of the yarn that I'm using for this is almost fingering weight. It's probably sport weight. I'm not quite sure, but it's also done in a fine alpaca. And so the fine alpaca is both, again, drapier, and since I'm using a slightly larger needle than I would for a fingering weight yarn, it actually is creating a lighter fabric. But garter stitch, on the other hand, creates a thicker fabric, because you've got the ridges of garter stitch that are making it thicker. So the combination is really nice. It's got the alpaca drape to it. It's got the rigidity of the garter stitch that you put in, and it also has the looseness of fabric based on the larger needle to the yarn size. So hopefully today, and you can read more about this project in my current knitting section of the blog today, but hopefully taking a look at some of these garments will help you assess and help you be able to determine, when you're making swatches of your own, what kind of garment that you want to make out of specific yarns, or whether in fact you want to change the needle size that you're working on, or change yarns completely. And hopefully that'll be helpful in doing that.